The early morning sun beamed down on the suburban neighborhood of Sycamore Grove, casting a warm glow on its tree-lined streets. It was a quiet, middle-class enclave where the lawns were always trimmed, the houses stood in neat rows, and the neighbors knew one another by first names. The kind of place where nothing much ever happened, at least not on the surface. The perfect place to live the American dream, some might say. But for Romeo Harris, this neighborhood was a daily reminder of both opportunity and invisible boundaries. At 17, Romeo was known by those around him as polite, smart, and hard-working. He had an innate knack for fixing things, especially cars, a talent he'd inherited from his father. The grease-stained afternoons spent in their modest garage tinkering with engines were some of Romeo's most cherished memories. It was where he learned that life, like an engine, could be messy and full of problems, but with the right tools and enough patience, anything could be fixed. The Harris family had lived in Sycamore Grove for nearly 10 years, having moved from a cramped apartment in the city. Lena Harris, Romeo's mother, saw the move as an opportunity to give her children a better life, safer streets, better schools, and the promise of a future untainted by the crime and noise of their old neighborhood. For Marcus Harris, Romeo's father, the move meant a chance to start fresh and build something new for his family. He'd always been an outspoken advocate for Black communities, organizing local events and working tirelessly to provide resources to underprivileged kids. But he knew that moving to a predominantly white suburb came with challenges. Romeo often felt those challenges in subtle ways. At school, some teachers praised him for being so well-behaved or articulate comments that at first felt like compliments, but over time became a reminder that their expectations of him were based on stereotypes. His classmates, though friendly, rarely invited him to hang out after school. He could sense the unspoken hesitation, the invisible walls that kept him on the periphery. Yet, despite it all, Romeo remained focused. He was determined to succeed, to break through those barriers, get a scholarship, and study mechanical engineering. His part-time job at Billy's auto shop was a step in that direction. Every weekday afternoon, after school let out, Romeo would head straight there, his backpack slung over one shoulder and a small toolbox in hand. Billy, the owner, was an old friend of Marcus Harris, and he took Romeo under his wing. "You've got the gift," Kid Billy often said, admiring how quickly Romeo picked up on things. "You remind me of your old man." One Saturday morning, Romeo was biking to Billy's shop, the wheels of his old bike squeaking in rhythm with his steady pedaling. It was the kind of day that felt too perfect for anything to go wrong. The air was crisp with the lingering coolness of the previous night, but the sun promised warmth as it rose higher. As Romeo rode past the rows of identical houses, his thoughts drifted to the cars he would be working on that day. There was an old 1968 Mustang that Billy had promised to let him help rebuild from the ground up. That car was all he could think about. Suddenly, up ahead, a small sedan sat stalled at the side of the road. Smoke puffed gently from the hood. Romeo's attention shifted instantly. He slowed his bike and squinted toward the car. It was Mrs. Roberts. Mrs. Roberts was the kind of neighbor who always kept to herself. At nearly 80 years old, she was frail but fiercely independent. Most people in the neighborhood knew of her but didn't really know her. She rarely left her home, except for her weekly trips to the grocery store or doctor appointments. Romeo had seen her before but had never spoken more than a few words to her in passing. As he approached, he could see her standing outside the car, a look of distress on her face. Her small, wrinkled hands fidgeted with a white handkerchief, and her eyes darted nervously from the car to the street. Something inside Romeo stirred the familiar instinct to help. Without hesitation, he pedaled toward her, pulling up beside the car. "Morning, Mrs. Roberts," he called out with a warm smile. "Looks like your car's giving you some trouble." Mrs. Roberts turned slowly, her eyes widening as she recognized him. There was a brief flash of something, maybe fear, maybe surprise, before her expression softened. "Oh, it's you. Romeo, right?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Yes, the car. It just stopped all of a sudden, and I don't know what to do." Romeo dismounted his bike and leaned it against the sidewalk. "Mind if I take a look?" Mrs. Roberts hesitated for a moment, her gaze lingering on Romeo as if she was weighing whether to trust him. Then, with a small nod, she stepped aside. Romeo popped the hood of the car and immediately saw the problem. A broken serpentine belt. It was a relatively simple fix, but without the part, There wasn't much he could do on the spot. Still, he figured he could at least give her some peace of mind. "It's the belt," he explained. "It snapped. That's why the car overheated. You'll need a new one, but I can help you get it fixed if you want." Mrs. Roberts blinked at him, her eyes softening as she processed his words. "You know how to fix cars?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mix of awe and disbelief. Romeo chuckled lightly. "Yeah, I work at Billy's auto shop. Been learning for a few years now." Mrs. Roberts seemed to relax, her shoulders loosening as she nodded. "Well, I didn't know that. I'm glad you came by when you did. I'm not sure what I would have done." Romeo gave her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Mrs. Roberts. I'll get it sorted out for you. How about this? I can give Billy a call, and we'll get a tow truck out here. Once we get it to the shop, I'll replace the belt for you free of charge." Mrs. Roberts looked at him, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something. There was a long pause before she finally spoke. "That's very kind of you, Romeo. Thank you." Just as Romeo was about to reach for his phone to call Billy, he noticed movement across the street. Mr. Richards, one of the nosy neighbors, was standing in his driveway, watching the scene unfold. Romeo could feel the man's eyes on him, and it made his skin crawl. He didn't need to hear what Mr. Richards was thinking. The look on his face said it all. Romeo turned back to Mrs. Roberts, doing his best to ignore the man's gaze. "I'll get that call in now." As he dialed Billy's number, Mrs. Roberts looked around nervously, her hands still clutching the handkerchief. "Romeo, I hope this isn't too much trouble for you. I don't want to inconvenience you." "No trouble at all," Romeo said, giving her a reassuring nod as Billy picked up the phone on the other end. After a brief conversation, Billy confirmed that he would send a tow truck over, and they'd take care of the car at the shop. Romeo hung up and turned back to Mrs. Roberts. "All set. The tow truck will be here in about 30 minutes. I'll head over to the shop with your car and fix it myself. You don't have to worry about a thing." Mrs. Roberts smiled, this time more warmly than before. "Thank you, Romeo. Really, I appreciate it." The sound of the approaching police car pierced the air before Romeo could respond. His heart sank as the flashing lights cast a strobe of red and blue across the quiet street. He saw Officer Mackey, one of the local officers, stepping out of the car, his hand already resting on his belt. Romeo felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Everything okay here?" Officer Mackey asked, his eyes narrowing as they shifted from Romeo to Mrs. Roberts. Mrs. Roberts, looking slightly alarmed by the sudden arrival, stepped forward. "Oh yes, officer, everything's fine. My car broke down and Romeo here is just helping me." Officer Mackey's eyes lingered on Romeo for a moment too long before turning back to Mrs. Roberts. "You're sure everything's fine, Ma?" "I am." Romeo could feel the tension building. He had seen this play out before, even in his own neighborhood. Being a young black man offering help often invited scrutiny. He wanted to speak up, but he knew better than to interrupt the officer. Mrs. Roberts seemed to sense the unease and nodded quickly. Yes, it's fine. He's helping me fix the car." Officer Mackey's posture didn't relax. He glanced back at Romeo, his tone skeptical. "You work at Billy's auto shop, right?" Romeo nodded. "Yes, sir." There was a long pause, as if the officer was weighing whether to take this further. Finally, he stepped back toward his car. "All right then, you folks take care." Romeo exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding as the officer drove off. Mrs. Roberts gave him a small, apologetic smile, but the damage was done. The suspicion had been planted. In Romeo's mind, it wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. The day had started out like any other, but as the afternoon wore on, the air in the Harris household felt unusually heavy. After fixing Mrs. Roberts' car and seeing it safely to Billy's auto shop, Romeo had spent the rest of the day trying to push the uneasy feeling out of his mind. The encounter with Officer Mackey had been unsettling, though not uncommon. As a young black man, Romeo was used to being looked at with suspicion, even when his actions were clearly helpful. He'd learned to swallow the frustration, to keep his head down and push forward. But today something was different. The look in Officer Mackey's eyes, the way Mr. Richards had been watching from across the street, it all left a bitter taste in Romeo's mouth that he couldn't shake. By the time he returned home, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the front lawn. His parents were in the living room, enjoying a rare quiet evening together. His mother, Lena Harris, was sitting on the couch, flipping through a book while his father, Marcus Harris, reclined in his favorite armchair, the TV remote in hand, half watching the evening news. "Hey, son," Marcus greeted without looking away from the TV. "How was work?" Romeo forced a smile, dropping his backpack on the floor near the stairs. "It was all right. Got Mrs. Roberts' car fixed. Simple belt replacement." Lena looked up from her book, concern creeping into her voice. "Mrs. Roberts' car? What happened to her?" "She broke down a few streets over. I was passing by on my bike, so I stopped to help. Got her towed to Billy's shop, and it's all taken care of now." Lena's brow furrowed. "She all right?" "Yeah, she's fine," Romeo said, trying to keep his tone light. "But..." Marcus finally turned away from the TV, picking up on the unease in his son's voice. "But what?" Romeo hesitated, running a hand through his short hair. The police showed up. The room went silent for a moment. Marcus sat up straight in his chair, and Lena put her book down completely. The tension was immediate, as if the very mention of the police had sucked all the air out of the room. "What do you mean the police showed up?" Marcus asked, his voice low and serious. "Officer Mackey. He saw me helping Mrs. Roberts and thought something was wrong. He questioned me, asked if I worked at Billy's, wanted to know if everything was okay." Romeo's frustration started to bubble up again, the memory of Mackey's suspicious glare making his blood pressure rise. "I mean, I was helping her. That's all. But the way he looked at me, it was like he thought I was up to no good." Lena shook her head, her expression tightening with worry. "Of course he did. That's how they always see us." Marcus let out a long sigh, rubbing his hand over his face. "Did Mrs. Roberts say anything? Did she back you up?" "Yeah, she told him I was helping her," but Romeo trailed off, struggling to put his thoughts into words. "But it didn't matter. He still looked at me like I was guilty, like he didn't believe her." Marcus nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "That's because it's not about what you're doing. It's about who you are. You know that." Romeo did know that. His father had drilled it into him since he was a little boy. "You have to be twice as good, twice as careful," Marcus would say, "because they're waiting for you to slip up to prove them right about you." It was a painful truth that Romeo had come to accept over the years, but that didn't make it any easier to stomach. Lena stood up from the couch, crossing the room to place a comforting hand on Romeo's shoulder. "You did the right thing by helping her, Romeo. Don't let that officer make you feel like you did something wrong." Romeo nodded, though the tightness in his chest remained. He wanted to believe that, but it was hard when every encounter with authority seemed to be a reminder that his good intentions weren't enough. He could be as polite and as helpful as possible, and yet, in their eyes, he would always be a potential threat. "I know, Mom," he said quietly. "It's just frustrating." Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his eyes sharp with the kind of resolve that had made him a well-known community organizer. "Look, Romeo, you keep your head up, all right? We can't control how they see us, but we can control how we respond. You're going to be an engineer one day, and you'll show them all that they were wrong about you." Romeo appreciated his father's words, but they felt hollow in that moment. He didn't want to think about proving anyone wrong, he just wanted to live his life without constantly feeling like he was under a microscope. "Yeah, I know," Romeo mumbled, forcing another smile. "I'm gonna head upstairs and finish some homework." Lena kissed the top of his head before he headed up the stairs. "We're proud of you, Romeo." As he climbed the stairs to his room, Romeo couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of it. Something about the way Officer Mackey had looked at him, the way Mr. Richards had been watching from his driveway, it all felt like a storm brewing just out of sight. The call that changes everything. The next morning started off just as usual. Romeo woke up, showered, and got dressed for school, determined to put the strange events of the day before behind him. His mind was focused on the exam he had in calculus that day. Math had always been his strong suit, and today was no exception. If anything, working with numbers and formulas was a welcome distraction from the thoughts that kept gnawing at the back of his mind. He grabbed his backpack and rushed downstairs to grab breakfast. Lena had already set out a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. She smiled warmly as Romeo plopped down at the table, already stuffing a bite into his mouth. "Good luck on your exam today," she said as she poured him a glass of orange juice. "You'll do great, I know it." "Thanks, Mom," Romeo replied, flashing her a quick smile. Just as he was about to finish his breakfast and head out the door, there was a loud, unexpected knock. The sound was forceful, sending an uneasy ripple through the air. Marcus, who had been reading the newspaper at the table, set it down and exchanged a glance with Lena. "Who could that be this early?" Lena asked, her voice laced with concern. Romeo, sensing the same unease, stood up from the table just as Marcus made his way to the door. When he opened it, there were two men standing on the porch, both dressed in dark suits. They looked official, too official. The kind of men who carried authority wherever they went. Romeo's stomach knotted immediately. He didn't need to see the badges hanging from their jackets to know they were law enforcement. "Good morning," one of the men said, his voice stern but controlled. "We're with the FBI. May we come in?" The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. Marcus stepped back, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. Lena stood frozen in place, her hand tightening on the edge of the kitchen counter. "What's this about?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but firm. The first agent, a tall man with graying hair and a hardened expression, glanced past Marcus into the house. "We're investigating an incident that occurred yesterday involving your son, Romeo Harris." The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as Romeo's heart began to pound. Lena gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Marcus frowned, his brows knitting together. "What incident? Romeo didn't do anything wrong." "We're not accusing him of anything yet," the second agent, a younger man with dark hair, interjected. "But we've received reports of suspicious behavior in the area, and we need to ask him a few questions." Romeo felt his throat go dry as the words "suspicious behavior" echoed in his ears. He stepped forward, his voice shaking slightly. "What's this about?" The older agent's eyes settled on him, his expression unreadable. "You were seen working on a car yesterday, correct? Mrs. Roberts' car." Romeo nodded, confusion swirling in his mind. "Yeah, I was helping her. Her car broke down and I fixed it." The younger agent pulled out a small notepad, flipping it open. "We have reason to believe that the vehicle you were working on might be connected to a string of recent thefts targeting elderly residents in this area. We'd like to know how you came into contact with the vehicle and what your relationship is with Mrs. Roberts." What? Romeo's voice cracked with disbelief. "You think I'm involved in car thefts? I was just helping her, she's my neighbor." Marcus stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking in. "My son isn't involved in any thefts. He was helping a woman in need, and that's all there is to it." The older agent raised a hand to calm the rising tension. "We understand that, Mr. Harris, but we need to follow up on all leads. We received a report from a witness in the neighborhood who found the situation suspicious, and we can't ignore that." Romeo's mind flashed back to Mr. Richards standing in his driveway, watching him like a hawk. Of course it was him. The knot in his stomach twisted tighter. He had only been trying to help, but in Mr. Richards' eyes, his very presence had been suspicious. "So what now?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with frustration. "We'd like Romeo to come down to the station with us and answer a few questions," the younger agent said, his tone formal but not unkind. "It won't take long. We just need to clear some things up." Lena's voice trembled as she stepped forward, her eyes wide with fear. "But he hasn't done anything. You're making a mistake." "We're just following procedure, ma'am," the older agent said calmly. "If everything checks out, he'll be back home in no time." Romeo felt like the ground was falling out from beneath him. His hands were shaking, though he tried to hide it. He looked to his parents, searching for some kind of reassurance, but the look of fear on their faces only deepened his own. Marcus put a hand on Romeo's shoulder, his voice low and steady. "Romeo, go with them. Answer their questions. We'll get to the bottom of this and we'll handle it." Romeo swallowed hard, nodding. He didn't want to go, but he knew he had no choice. "All right." As he stepped out of the house, flanked by the two FBI agents, he couldn't help but feel like he was walking into a trap. A part of him wanted to scream, to shout that this was all a misunderstanding. But another part of him, the part that had been conditioned to stay calm in the face of authority, kept him silent. As they walked to the unmarked black car parked in front of his house, Romeo's heart raced. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had only been trying to help. But now, it felt like his world was collapsing in on itself, and he didn't know how to stop it. The ride to the FBI field office was tense and silent. Romeo sat in the back of the unmarked car, his mind racing faster than the trees and buildings blurring outside his window. The agents, stoic and unyielding, exchanged few words between them, their focus on the road and the task ahead. Romeo couldn't help but feel small and powerless, as though he was on a conveyor belt toward an unknown fate that had been set in motion by nothing more than a misunderstanding. His mind replayed the events of the previous day over and over. Had he done something wrong? Could he have said something differently? No, he had been helping Mrs. Roberts, and yet here he was, on his way to answer for a crime he didn't commit. When they pulled into the parking lot of the FBI office, the knot in Romeo's stomach tightened. The glass and steel building loomed above them like a fortress, its cold exterior reflecting the late morning sun. The agents opened the car door, motioning for Romeo to follow them inside. He took a deep breath, trying to steel himself. His father's voice echoed in his mind, "Keep your head up. Stay calm. Don't give them any reason to use your emotions against you." He'd heard those words time and again, and now they felt more relevant than ever. Inside, the office was just as cold and sterile as the building's exterior. Everything was sleek, modern, and unwelcoming. The agents led Romeo down a long hallway, their footsteps echoing off the polished floor, until they reached a small, windowless room. The walls were white, the table metal, and two plain chairs sat opposite one another. It felt more like an interrogation room than a meeting space, and as Romeo sat down, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Just wait here for a moment," the older agent said, his voice neutral. "Someone will be with you shortly." Romeo nodded, his throat too dry to respond. The two agents left the room, closing the door behind them with a soft click. Romeo sat alone, his heart thudding in his chest. He glanced at the plain white walls, feeling like they were closing in on him. The silence in the room was oppressive, punctuated only by the faint hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. It was the kind of silence that made you question everything, even your own innocence. After what felt like an eternity, the door finally opened again, and a new figure stepped inside. He was a tall, middle-aged man with a well-tailored suit and a no-nonsense air about him. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he carried a file folder under his arm. Romeo's eyes followed the man's every move as he crossed the room and sat down across from him, placing the folder on the table between them. "Romeo Harris," the man asked, his voice professional but without warmth. "Yes, sir," Romeo replied quietly, sitting up straight in his chair. "I'm Agent Peterson. I'm the lead investigator on this case," the man said, flipping open the folder. His eyes scanned the contents before landing on Romeo again. "We're looking into a series of burglaries that have occurred in this neighborhood recently. Elderly victims specifically have been targeted. Items have been stolen from their homes, mostly cash and valuables. Yesterday, a report came in about you working on Mrs. Roberts' car, and, well, here we are." Romeo blinked, stunned by the sudden jump to conclusions. "I was just helping her fix her car. That's all." Peterson leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I understand that's your perspective, but we've got witnesses in the neighborhood who claim that the activity seemed suspicious. There's a pattern to these crimes, and we have to follow up on any leads we get." Romeo felt anger bubbling up inside him. Suspicious? Because he had stopped to help a neighbor in need? He clenched his fists under the table, reminding himself to stay calm. "Don't let your emotions show," he thought. "I didn't do anything wrong," Romeo said firmly, but his voice remained calm. "I was on my way to work at Billy's auto shop when I saw Mrs. Roberts stranded. I offered to help because I've been working with cars for years. I even called my boss, Billy, to send a tow truck. You can ask him. He'll back me up." Agent Peterson studied him for a long moment, his fingers tapping idly on the surface of the table. "We will be speaking to your boss," he said finally. "But right now we're focusing on your involvement with Mrs. Roberts and whether this was part of a larger scheme." A scheme? Romeo couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I don't have any scheme, I was just being a good neighbor." Peterson remained unfazed by Romeo's frustration. "Romeo, I need you to understand that we're not accusing you of anything yet. But we do need to rule out all possibilities, And right now, the fact is that you were seen working on the car of an elderly woman who fits the victim profile in this string of crimes. Given the circumstances, we need to ask some questions to determine what's really going on. Romeo felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. No matter what he said, it felt like they were already treating him as guilty, as though his mere presence at the scene was enough to implicate him in something far larger. His mind raced, searching for some way to prove his innocence. But what could he do? He had been alone when he helped Mrs. Roberts, and the only other person who could corroborate his story was her. "Can I call my parents?" Romeo asked, his voice quieter now, the weight of the situation sinking in deeper. Peterson nodded. "You can call them, but let's finish going through these questions first. We just want to get a clear picture of what happened." Romeo wanted nothing more than to get up and walk out of the room, but he knew that wouldn't help his situation. He took a deep breath and braced himself for the barrage of questions that would follow. For the next hour, Agent Peterson questioned Romeo about every minute detail of the previous day's events. What time did he see Mrs. Roberts? How long had he been working on the car? Did anyone else stop by while he was helping her? Was there anything unusual about the situation? Each question felt more accusatory than the last, as though Peterson was digging for anything that could paint Romeo as more than just a helpful neighbor. Romeo answered each question truthfully, trying his best to remain composed despite the growing sense of dread in his chest. He explained how Mrs. Roberts' car had overheated due to a broken belt, how he had called Billy to send a tow truck, and how Mrs. Roberts had thanked him before they parted ways. But as the interrogation dragged on, Romeo could see that Peterson wasn't satisfied. The agent scribbled notes in his file, his expression a constant mask of detached professionalism. Finally, when the questions seemed to taper off, Peterson closed the file and leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "Romeo, I'm going to be straight with you," Peterson said, his tone shifting to something more direct. "We've seen cases like this before. Someone, usually a younger person, gains the trust of an elderly victim, helps them with something simple like fixing a car, and then, over time, they start taking advantage of that trust. They might even convince the victim to let them into their home. And that's when the thefts happen." Romeo's stomach twisted as he realized what Peterson was implying. "Wait, you think I'm trying to con her? That I'm planning to steal from her? I'm not." "I'm not saying that's what happened," Peterson interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "But we have to consider the possibility. It's our job to protect vulnerable people in the community, and right now you fit a profile that we've seen in other cases." Romeo couldn't believe what he was hearing. Fit a profile? What did that even mean? Was it because he was young? Because he was black? His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but the anger building inside him made it hard to think clearly. "I'm not that person," Romeo said, his voice shaking slightly. "I wasn't trying to steal from her. I didn't even go inside her house. I just fixed the car. And that's it." Peterson studied him for a moment, then sighed. "All right, we're not making any decisions today. We're going to continue investigating, talk to Mrs. Roberts, and check with your boss at the auto shop. But I need you to understand something. Romeo, this isn't going away anytime soon, even if you didn't do anything wrong. There are people in the neighborhood who believe you did, and we have to take that seriously." Romeo's heart sank at the words. "Even if you didn't do anything wrong, there are people who believe you did. It didn't matter what the truth was, what mattered was what people thought the truth was. And right now it seemed like the entire world was lined up against him." "Am I free to go?" Romeo asked quietly. Peterson nodded. "For now, yes, but we'll be in touch. And I would advise you to avoid contact with Mrs. Roberts until we've completed our investigation." Romeo stood up from the table, feeling like the weight of the world was pressing down on his shoulders. As he followed the agents out of the room and back toward the lobby, he felt numb. He had done nothing wrong, but here he was, caught up in something that was spiraling out of control. When Romeo returned home, his parents were waiting anxiously. Lena was pacing in the living room, her face pale with worry, while Marcus sat on the edge of the couch, his hands clasped tightly together. The moment Romeo walked through the door, Lena rushed to his side, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Oh my God, Romeo, are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm fine," Mom, Romeo muttered, though the truth was, he felt anything but fine. Marcus stood up, his eyes sharp with concern. What did they ask you? Did they accuse you of something? Romeo sighed, pulling away from his mother and sinking into a chair. They think I might be involved in some kind of scam. They asked a bunch of questions about Mrs. Roberts and the burglaries in the neighborhood. Marcus clenched his jaw, the anger radiating off him in waves. This is profiling, plain and simple. They don't have anything on you, but they're looking for a reason to pin this on you because you're the easiest target. Lena sat down beside Romeo, her hand resting on his arm. What are we going to do? They can't just accuse him without any proof. Marcus paced the room, his fists clenched at his sides. We're not going to let them railroad him. I'm calling a lawyer. We'll fight this every step of the way. Romeo wanted to feel reassured by his father's words, but all he could feel was the crushing weight of the situation. The FBI might not have formally accused him yet, but they had planted the seeds of suspicion, and he knew how easily those seeds could grow into something much more dangerous. Romeo, Marcus said, turning to face his son, you need to keep your head up. They want you to feel scared, to feel guilty even when you've done nothing wrong. But we're going to fight this, all right? We're not going to let them tear you down. Romeo nodded, though his heart wasn't in it. He didn't want to be the focus of this battle. He didn't want to fight. He just wanted things to go back to normal, to be the kid who fixed cars and dreamed of being an engineer. But after today, he knew that nothing would ever be normal again. The days that followed felt like a blur for Romeo. The weight of the investigation hung over him like a dark cloud, looming in every corner of his life. Every time he walked down the street, he could feel the stares from his neighbors, their whispers brushing against him like cold wind. He'd never been a stranger in Sycamore Grove, but now he felt like an outsider in the very place he'd called home for most of his life. There were no friendly nods from Mr. Harris, who lived 2 doors down, no casual waves from the kids riding their bikes through the cul-de-sac. It was as if the FBI's questions had turned Romeo into a walking question mark, an unsolved puzzle that everyone was eager to figure out, or worse, cast blame upon. At school, things weren't much better. Romeo had always been a focused student, excelling in math and science, but now even his teachers seemed to look at him differently. His calculus teacher, Mr. Grayson, usually greeted him with a nod of approval, impressed by his ability to solve the most complex equations with ease. But lately his nods had grown stiff, his eyes narrowed with something Romeo couldn't quite place: disappointment, maybe, or suspicion. It was as though the entire world had suddenly decided that Romeo Harris wasn't the young man they had once thought him to be. Worse still were the rumors that had begun to swirl among his classmates. In the hallways, in the cafeteria, whispers followed him like shadows. Did you hear about Romeo? They say the FBI is investigating him. Yeah, my mom said he might be involved in those robberies. Can you believe it? I always thought he was kind of suspicious, didn't you? Romeo wanted to scream at them, to tell them they were wrong, that he hadn't done anything. But what good would that do? No one was interested in hearing his side of the story. People believed what they wanted to believe, and once they had made up their minds, it was nearly impossible to change them. A few days after the FBI interrogation, Romeo was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his homework. His mind was elsewhere, drifting in a fog of frustration and confusion. The sound of the doorbell jolted him back to reality, and he looked up as his mother, Lena, went to answer it. The murmurs of conversation filtered through the hallway, and Romeo recognized the soft, hesitant voice of Mrs. Roberts. Romeo's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen her since the day he helped her with her car. Part of him had been avoiding her, too afraid of what she might think after everything that had happened. Was she here to accuse him? To confirm the neighborhood's suspicions? He wasn't sure if he could handle it. Romeo, can you come here for a moment? His mother called from the front door. Taking a deep breath, Romeo stood up and made his way to the door. There, standing on the porch, was Mrs. Roberts, her small, frail figure framed by the sunlight. She looked nervous, wringing her hands together as she shifted from foot to foot. Her eyes met Romeo's, and for a moment they both stood there in an uncomfortable silence. Mrs. Roberts, Romeo said finally, his voice tight. Is everything okay? Mrs. Roberts cleared her throat, her voice trembling slightly. I wanted to talk to you, Romeo. I've been meaning to for a few days, but, well, things have been a bit difficult. Romeo's mother, sensing the tension, stepped back to give them some space. Why don't you come in, Mrs. Roberts? Have a seat. Mrs. Roberts hesitated for a moment before nodding and stepping inside. She sat down on the couch, her hands still fidgeting nervously in her lap. Romeo remained standing, unsure of what to expect. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, Mrs. Roberts began, her voice barely above a whisper. About you helping me with the car, and everything that's happened since. Romeo watched her carefully, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the way she struggled to find the right words. I'm so sorry, Romeo, she said finally, her voice cracking. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't know that people would take things the wrong way. I never should have let it get this far. Romeo blinked, stunned by her words. He hadn't expected this. In his mind, he had prepared himself for anger, for accusations, but not for an apology. It's not your fault, Mrs. Roberts, Romeo said quietly. You didn't do anything wrong. Mrs. Roberts shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. No, Romeo, it is my fault. I should have spoken up sooner. I should have told everyone that you were just helping me, that you weren't involved in anything wrong. But I was scared that if I said something, they wouldn't believe me. Or they'd think I was, I don't know, being naive. Romeo's chest tightened with a mix of emotions, anger, relief, frustration. He wanted to scream at her for not standing up for him earlier, for letting him endure days of suspicion and judgment. But at the same time, he could see how this whole situation had affected her too. Mrs. Roberts, in her old age, wasn't used to being caught in the middle of something so chaotic. She wasn't equipped to handle the fallout. I understand, Romeo said finally, his voice softer. But we need to fix this. The FBI. They think I'm involved in something, and I'm not. I've never done anything like that. Mrs. Roberts nodded, wiping at her eyes. I'll tell them. I'll tell the FBI and the police and anyone else who will listen. I'll tell them that you were just helping me, and that's all. Romeo felt a small flicker of hope at her words. It wasn't much, but it was something. If Mrs. Roberts could vouch for him, maybe it would help clear his name, maybe it would be enough to stop the investigation. But even as that thought crossed his mind, another darker one followed close behind. Would it really make a difference? Would people even listen to her now that the damage had already been done? The next morning, Romeo and his parents, along with Mrs. Roberts, drove to the FBI field office. Marcus had insisted on bringing along their lawyer, Mr. Jennings, a sharp, no-nonsense man who had been handling civil rights cases for years. He had been one of the first people Marcus called after the FBI's initial visit, and now, as they prepared to confront the agents again, Romeo felt a sense of reassurance in knowing that they weren't going into this fight alone. As they sat in the waiting area, the tension was palpable. Lena sat beside Romeo, her hand resting on his knee, her thumb brushing gently over the fabric of his jeans in a rhythmic, calming motion. Marcus was on the other side, his jaw clenched, his fingers tapping impatiently on the arm of the chair. Mrs. Roberts sat across from them, her posture stiff, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Are you ready for this? Marcus asked, his voice low and steady. Romeo nodded, though the truth was he wasn't sure if he was ready for anything. But what choice did he have? This was his life, his future on the line. He couldn't afford to back down now. After what felt like an eternity, Agent Peterson finally appeared, his face as expressionless as ever. He nodded to the group, then led them into the same small, sterile room where he had questioned Romeo before. Once they were all seated, Mr. Jennings wasted no time getting to the point. Agent Peterson Jennings began, his voice smooth but firm. We're here today to clear up some misunderstandings regarding my client, Romeo Harris. Mrs. Roberts has something she would like to say. Peterson's eyes flicked toward Mrs. Roberts, his expression unchanged. All right, I'm listening. Mrs. Roberts took a deep breath, her voice shaky as she began to speak. I want to make it clear that Romeo Harris is not involved in any kind of scheme or theft or anything like that. He was helping me with my car because it broke down and he was being a good neighbor. That's all. I'm very sorry if this has caused any confusion, but he's innocent. Peterson listened carefully, his hands folded in front of him on the table. When Mrs. Roberts finished, he nodded slowly but said nothing at first. The silence in the room was suffocating as everyone waited for his response. Mrs. Roberts. Peterson said, "Finally, I appreciate you coming in to clarify this. We take witness testimony very seriously, but I need you to understand that this investigation is about more than just one incident. There have been multiple reports of thefts in this neighborhood, and we're following every lead we have." "But he's not involved," Mrs. Roberts insisted, her voice stronger now. "I'm telling you, Romeo is innocent." Peterson shifted in his seat, his eyes meeting Mr. Jennings. "We're not saying he's guilty, but we can't just end an investigation based on one statement. We still need to gather all the facts." "Gather your facts," then Marcus interjected, his voice firm but controlled. "But you'd better not drag my son's name through the mud in the process. He's innocent, and you're treating him like a criminal." Peterson didn't flinch at Marcus's words, though Romeo could see the tension in the agent's shoulders. "We're treating this case the way we would any other. I understand your frustration, but we have to be thorough." Romeo's anger flared. "Thorough? You're accusing me of something I didn't do because I happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was just helping Mrs. Roberts, and now my whole life is falling apart because someone made an assumption about me." Peterson's gaze softened slightly, though his tone remained professional. "I hear you, Romeo, and like I said, we're not accusing you of anything yet. But this process takes time, and we need to make sure we're doing everything by the book." "By the book," Jennings cut in smoothly, "does not give you the right to violate this young man's civil rights. Romeo has cooperated fully with your investigation, and yet his reputation is being destroyed because of baseless accusations. If this continues, we will be pursuing legal action." The room fell silent again, and for a moment Peterson seemed to weigh his options. Finally he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "All right, we'll speak to your boss at the auto shop and we'll review any further evidence we have. But if we find no direct connection to these thefts, then we'll close the investigation on Romeo. Is that acceptable?" "It's a start," Jennings said, his voice firm. Peterson nodded, standing up from the table. "You'll hear from us soon." The drive home was quiet. Mrs. Roberts had been dropped off at her house, and now it was just Romeo, his parents, and their lawyer sitting in the car, each lost in their own thoughts. The weight of the situation still pressed heavily on Romeo's chest, but for the first time in days he felt a small glimmer of hope. "They're going to close this investigation," son Marcus said finally, breaking the silence. "They don't have anything on you, and once they speak to Billy they'll realize they've made a mistake." Romeo nodded, though his mind was still clouded with doubt. The damage had already been done. People in the neighborhood, his classmates, even his teachers had already started treating him differently. Even if the FBI cleared his name, would things ever go back to the way they were? Mr. Jennings turned around in his seat, offering Romeo a small smile. "We'll make sure they close this case, Romeo. You've got a strong family backing you up, and you've got the truth on your side. Just hang in there a little longer." Romeo managed a weak smile in return. "Thanks." But as they pulled into the driveway, Romeo couldn't help but wonder how long that small glimmer of hope would last, and whether it would be enough to pull him through the storm that still loomed on the horizon. The next few days felt like a strange limbo for Romeo. Although the FBI had agreed to reevaluate the situation, the stigma of being investigated hung over his head like a dark, oppressive cloud. His parents did their best to maintain an air of normalcy, but even they couldn't hide their worry. Lena had stopped reading the newspaper in the mornings, knowing full well that every glance at the headlines would send her mind spiraling. Marcus, always the pillar of strength, had become quieter. His anger simmered beneath the surface, but he focused on keeping the family united, knowing how fragile Romeo's emotions were. For Romeo, the world outside his home had changed. Everywhere he went, the weight of others' judgment followed him. His once friendly neighborhood was now filled with eyes that either avoided him or watched him too closely, as if every step he took was laced with suspicion. The worst part was school. In the past, it had been his sanctuary, a place where he excelled and stood out for his achievements, not for the color of his skin. But since the investigation had begun, even his closest friends had started to pull away. Eric, one of his longtime friends, had stopped texting him altogether. At lunch, Jasmine and Lamar, two other friends, hesitated before sitting with him, their usual chatter replaced by awkward silences. "Hey man," Lamar said one day, trying too hard to sound casual as he sat down across from Romeo. "How's everything going with that situation?" Romeo looked up from his tray of untouched food, his appetite long gone since the investigation had started. "It's fine," he said shortly, though his voice lacked conviction. "They're still looking into it." Jasmine shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the cafeteria. "I'm sure it'll all work out," she said, though her tone was uncertain. "I mean, they can't just keep accusing you with no evidence, right?" "Yeah," Romeo muttered, stabbing his fork into a piece of chicken. "That's what we're hoping." But deep down, Romeo wasn't sure anymore. The investigation had opened up a new world of doubt, not just from the authorities but from everyone around him. It was as if people couldn't wait for the FBI to prove what they already believed, that he, Romeo Harris, the kid who had always done everything right, was hiding something. "Listen, man," Lamar said, leaning in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I heard some people talking. They're saying maybe it's true, that you might be involved in the burglaries." Romeo's fork stopped mid-motion, and he stared at Lamar, disbelief washing over him. "What?" "I'm not saying I believe it," Lamar added quickly, raising his hands defensively. "I'm just saying, that's what people are saying." Romeo's stomach churned, the food on his plate suddenly making him nauseous. He pushed his tray away, his appetite completely gone. Why would they think that, he asked, his voice shaking with frustration. "I've never stolen anything in my life." I know, Lamar said, trying to backtrack. "But people talk, and with everything going on, it's easy for them to jump to conclusions." Jasmine nodded slowly, biting her lip. "It's not fair, but that's how people are. They always want to believe the worst." Romeo leaned back in his chair, his fists clenching under the table. He wanted to yell, to scream at the injustice of it all, but what good would it do? People had already made up their minds, and no matter how much he protested, they weren't going to change their opinions overnight. "Whatever," Romeo muttered, standing up abruptly. "I'm not hungry." "Romeo, wait," Jasmine called after him. But he was already walking away, his anger boiling over. He shoved through the cafeteria doors and into the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. He knew the school day wasn't over, but he didn't care. He couldn't sit through another class, pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. The walls of the school, once familiar and comforting, now felt like they were closing in on him. He needed to get out, to breathe, to escape the suffocating weight of suspicion that had wrapped itself around his life. When Romeo got home later that afternoon, he found his father pacing the living room, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. Marcus's face was tense, his brows furrowed as he muttered to himself, clearly frustrated. Lena was sitting on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her expression mirroring her husband's anxiety. "What's going on?" Romeo asked, stepping into the room. His parents exchanged a glance, and Marcus sighed heavily, running a hand over his face. "We've got a problem." Romeo frowned. "What kind of problem?" Lena gestured to the laptop on the coffee table, where a local news website was open, the headline glaring back at him in bold letters. "FBI investigates local teen in connection with neighborhood thefts." Romeo's stomach dropped. "What? They put this in the news?" "They did," Marcus said grimly, "and now the whole town knows about it." Romeo felt his heart pounding in his chest as he stared at the screen. His name wasn't mentioned in the article, but it didn't have to be. Everyone in Sycamore Grove knew who the local teen was. There weren't many black families in the neighborhood, and it didn't take much for people to put two and two together. "This is bad," Romeo, Lena said quietly, her voice trembling with worry. "People are talking. Your father's already had a few phone calls from some concerned neighbors." Romeo felt a rush of anger. "Concerned? What are they concerned about? I didn't do anything." "We know that," Marcus said firmly. "But it doesn't matter to them. They see this headline, and that's all they need to jump to conclusions." Romeo's mind raced. This wasn't just a matter of clearing his name with the FBI anymore. This was about his reputation, his future. How was he supposed to go on after this? Even if the FBI cleared him, people would still look at him differently. They would still whisper behind his back, still think of him as the kid who had been investigated for theft. "This is insane," Romeo muttered, pacing the room. "What are we supposed to do?" "We're going to fight this," Marcus said, his voice filled with determination. "I've already spoken to Mr. Jennings. We're going to demand a formal statement from the FBI clearing your name once this is over. And I'm going to organize a community meeting. People need to hear the truth, and we're going to make sure they do." Romeo wasn't sure how much faith he had in the idea of a community meeting. Would it really change people's minds? Would it stop the rumors? But he knew his father wasn't the type to back down from a fight, and right now Romeo needed all the support he could get. "All right," Romeo said quietly, though the doubt still gnawed at him. "But what if it doesn't work? What if people still think I'm guilty?" Marcus walked over to his son and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we keep fighting. We don't give up, Romeo. Not ever." Romeo nodded, though the weight of the world still pressed heavily on him. He wanted to believe that everything would work out, that the truth would win in the end. But as the headlines spread and the whispers grew louder, he couldn't shake the feeling that things would never go back to the way they were. A week later, Marcus held the promised community meeting at the local church, a large building with stained glass windows and rows of pews that could seat hundreds. The turnout was significant. Residents from every corner of Sycamore Grove had shown up, curious about what the Harris family had to say. Some came out of genuine concern for Romeo, but many came out of morbid curiosity, eager to see what drama would unfold. Romeo sat in the front row beside his parents, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, the stares of people who once greeted him with warm smiles now filled with uncertainty. In the back of the room, he spotted Mr. Richards, the neighbor who had started this whole nightmare by calling the police that day. He was standing with a small group of other neighbors, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Marcus stood at the front of the room, his voice commanding as he spoke into the microphone. "Thank you all for coming tonight. We're here to address the rumors and accusations that have been circulating about my son, Romeo Harris." A murmur spread through the crowd as people shifted in their seats, some leaning forward in anticipation. "For those of you who don't know," Marcus continued, "Romeo has been the subject of an FBI investigation. He was questioned because he helped a neighbor, Mrs. Roberts, when her car broke down. Somehow, that act of kindness has been twisted into suspicion, and now people are saying things that aren't true." Mrs. Roberts, seated beside the Harris family, nodded vigorously. She had been a vocal supporter of Romeo since their visit to the FBI office, but even her words had done little to quell the storm of gossip. "I'm here to tell you all that my son is innocent," Marcus said firmly. "He has done nothing wrong. The FBI has yet to find any evidence linking him to the thefts, and we are confident that they will close the investigation soon." A man in the audience, Mr. Johnson, raised his hand. "But if he's innocent, why is the FBI involved at all? They don't just investigate for no reason." Marcus's jaw tightened. "The FBI is following up on reports from the neighborhood. They received a tip that was based on nothing more than a misunderstanding, but once those wheels start turning, it's hard to stop them. That's why we're here tonight, to set the record straight." More murmurs spread through the crowd, but it was clear that not everyone was convinced. Romeo could feel the skepticism in the air, the doubt that clung to him like a shadow. Suddenly, Mrs. Roberts stood up, her frail frame trembling as she spoke. "Romeo didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "He was helping me that day. My car had broken down, and I didn't know what to do. Romeo came to my aid when no one else did. He's a good boy, and it breaks my heart to see him treated this way." Her words carried weight in the room, and for a moment the whispers quieted. But even as Mrs. Roberts defended him, Romeo knew that some people wouldn't be satisfied until they had proof that he wasn't the monster they had built up in their minds. As the meeting continued, other neighbors spoke up, some in support of Romeo, others with lingering doubts. Marcus and Lena defended their son fiercely, with Mr. Jennings providing legal context when necessary. But no matter how many people spoke in his favor, the undercurrent of suspicion remained. Romeo sat quietly through it all, his heart heavy. He wanted to believe that the meeting would change things, that his neighbors would see the truth and realize that he was just a kid who had been caught up in something he didn't deserve. But as the night wore on, he realized that clearing his name wouldn't be that simple. By the time the meeting ended, The mood in the room was tense. Some people approached Romeo to offer their support, but others left quickly, their eyes avoiding his as they shuffled out of the church. "We did what we could," Marcus said as they walked to the car, his arm around Romeo's shoulders. "Now we just have to wait and see." Romeo nodded, though the sinking feeling in his chest told him that waiting might not be enough. In the days that followed, Romeo couldn't shake the feeling that the damage had already been done. The FBI might eventually clear his name, but in the eyes of the neighborhood, he would always be the kid who had been under investigation. The whispers had slowed, but they hadn't stopped. People still looked at him differently, still hesitated when they spoke to him. At school, things hadn't improved much either. Lamar and Jasmine tried to act like everything was normal, but Romeo could feel the awkwardness between them. Other classmates still gave him a wide berth, their eyes darting toward him whenever he passed by in the hallways. The weight of it all pressed down on him, suffocating in its quiet persistence. Even when he was at home, surrounded by his family, the doubts crept in, whispering in the back of his mind. What if this never ended? What if, no matter what he did, he would always be seen as the suspect? One evening, as he sat in his room staring blankly at his homework, Lena knocked on the door and stepped inside. "Romeo," she said softly, sitting down on the edge of his bed. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine, Mom," he muttered, though they both knew it was a lie. Lena sighed, her eyes filled with sadness as she reached out to stroke his hair. "I know this is hard," she said gently, "but you're strong. You're going to get through this." Romeo wanted to believe her, but the doubt was too strong. "What if people never stop looking at me like this?" he asked quietly. "What if they never stop thinking I'm guilty?" Lena's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she cupped his face in her hands. "You listen to me, Romeo. You are not defined by what other people think of you. You know who you are. Your father and I know who you are, and the people who really matter will see that too. Don't let their ignorance change who you are." Romeo swallowed hard, nodding as he tried to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over. I just want it to be over." "It will be," Lena promised. "It will be." But as Romeo lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help but wonder how long it would take and whether his life would ever truly return to normal. The long-awaited call came late one evening, nearly 2 weeks after the community meeting. Romeo was in his room, staring blankly at the ceiling, trying to ignore the faint sound of his parents' conversation downstairs. He had become accustomed to this lying in bed while his mind raced with thoughts he couldn't escape. School had become a blur of awkward encounters, whispers behind his back, and the gnawing feeling that no matter what he did, things would never return to the way they had been. The ringtone startled him, pulling him out of his spiral of thoughts. He picked up his phone and glanced at the screen, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the name Billy. "Hey, Billy," Romeo said as he answered, his voice heavy with fatigue. There was a pause on the other end, then Billy's familiar, gravelly voice came through. "Romeo, I've got some news for you, kid. The FBI just left the shop." Romeo sat up in bed, the tension that had been building inside him for days tightening even further. What did they say? His voice was quiet, but the anxiety was palpable. "They're closing the investigation," Billy said, and for the first time in weeks, Romeo heard a glimmer of relief in his voice. "They talked to me, went over everything, and they couldn't find any evidence linking you to the thefts. It's over, Romeo. They're done with it." For a moment, Romeo just sat there, the words hanging in the air like they didn't quite belong to him. It's over. The words felt too good to be true. He had been holding on to hope for so long, but now that the moment had come, he didn't know how to feel. "Really?" Romeo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's really over." "Yeah, kid," Billy replied, his tone softening. "You're in the clear. I knew it all along, but now it's official. They're going to send something in writing, and you'll have a clean slate." A wave of emotion crashed over Romeo: relief, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. He had been holding on to this weight for so long, and now that it was gone, he didn't know what to do with the emptiness it left behind. "Thanks, Billy," Romeo said, his voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for everything." "Hey, don't thank me," Billy said, chuckling softly. "You're a good kid, Romeo, always have been. I just did what any decent person would do." Romeo smiled, though the ache in his chest remained. "Still, thanks." They hung up, and Romeo sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone. He wanted to feel better, he wanted to celebrate the fact that his name had been cleared, but the lingering doubt still gnawed at him. He had been vindicated, but that didn't mean everything would go back to normal. The FBI might be done with him, but the neighborhood, his school, his classmates, how would they respond? He walked downstairs slowly, his mind heavy with uncertainty. When he reached the living room, Lena and Marcus looked up at him expectantly. Their faces were lined with worry, the stress of the past weeks etched deeply into their expressions. "Who was that on the phone?" Marcus asked, his voice cautious. "It was Billy," Romeo replied quietly. "The FBI's closing the investigation. They're not going to pursue it any further." Lena gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. "Oh, Romeo," she whispered, rushing over to him and pulling him into a tight embrace. Thank God it's over." Marcus stood up, his face softening as he approached his son. "I knew it," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "I knew they didn't have anything on you." Romeo nodded, allowing himself to relax slightly in his mother's arms. For a moment, the weight of the past few weeks lifted, replaced by the warmth of his family's love and support. But even as Lena hugged him tightly, Romeo couldn't help but feel the remnants of the storm that had battered them all. "It's over," Romeo repeated, as if saying it out loud would make it feel more real. Over the next few days, word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. Marcus and Lena made sure to inform Mr. Jennings, their lawyer, who worked swiftly to secure a formal statement from the FBI clearing Romeo of any involvement in the thefts. The statement was posted online, printed in the local newspaper, and shared through community channels. It was official: Romeo Harris had been exonerated. But even as the official word came through, the reality of the situation was far more complicated. The day after the statement was released, Romeo decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. He hadn't felt comfortable walking around freely since the investigation began, but now that the case was closed, he wanted to see how things had changed, if they had changed at all. As he walked down the familiar streets, he noticed the subtle shifts in the way people interacted with him. Some of the neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now gave him cautious nods or tight-lipped smiles, as if they weren't sure whether to fully embrace him back into the fold. Others, like Mr. Richards, continued to watch him from a distance, their expressions cold and indifferent. It was clear that some people had already made up their minds about Romeo, and no amount of formal statements would change their opinions. At one point, Romeo passed by Mrs. Roberts' house. The elderly woman was sitting on her front porch, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. When she saw Romeo, her face lit up, and she waved him over with a gentle smile. "Romeo, dear," she called, her voice warm and welcoming. "Come sit with me for a moment." He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he wanted to talk to her, but he knew that Mrs. Roberts had done her best to defend him throughout the ordeal. With a sigh, he walked up the driveway and sat beside her on the porch swing. "I heard the good news," she said, her eyes twinkling with relief. "I'm so glad they've finally cleared your name." "Yeah," Romeo replied, his voice subdued. "It's over." Mrs. Roberts studied him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "But it doesn't feel over, does it?" Romeo looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. "No, not really." The old woman nodded, her expression softening. "It takes time, Romeo. People's minds don't change as quickly as we'd like them to. Some people will hold on to their suspicions, no matter what the facts are. But the people who matter, the ones who know the truth, they'll stand by you." Romeo appreciated her words, but the truth was, he wasn't sure who really stood by him anymore. Even some of his closest friends had pulled away during the investigation, and though the FBI had cleared him, the damage to his relationships remained. "I just don't get why this all happened in the first place," Romeo muttered, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to help, and now it feels like I'll never be able to shake this." Mrs. Roberts reached out and placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You didn't do anything wrong, Romeo. What happened to you, it wasn't fair. But life isn't always fair, especially for young black men like you." Romeo looked up at her, surprised by her candor. "I may be old, Mrs. Roberts continued, but I'm not blind. I've seen how the world works, and I've seen how people like you, people who don't fit into their narrow definitions of good or safe, get treated differently. It's not right. But that's the world we live in. The only thing you can do is keep your head high and show them that you're better than their prejudices." Romeo took in her words, letting them sink into the deepest parts of him. He had always known that being black in America came with certain challenges, but this experience had opened his eyes to the extent of the biases and suspicions that people carried with them every day. "Thanks, Mrs. Roberts," Romeo said softly. "For everything." She smiled, her wrinkled face glowing with warmth. "You're a good boy, Romeo. Don't ever forget that." Despite the challenges that remained, Romeo found a sense of clarity in the days that followed. The investigation may have been over, but the journey to rebuild his life was just beginning. The lingering suspicion from some neighbors and classmates would take time to fade, if it ever did at all, but Romeo was determined not to let it break him. The support from his parents remained his greatest source of strength. Marcus, ever the fighter, encouraged Romeo to channel his frustration as something productive. He suggested that Romeo get involved in community activism, to use his voice and his experience to advocate for change. "You've seen firsthand how the system works," Marcus told him one evening as they sat on the back porch. "Now you have a chance to make a difference. You can help other kids who might find themselves in situations like yours." Romeo wasn't sure if he was ready for that just yet, but the idea planted a seed in his mind. Maybe there was a way to turn this nightmare into something positive, to use his voice to shine a light on the injustices that had plagued him, and so many others like him. In the meantime, he focused on his future. He threw himself back into his studies, determined to get his grades back on track after weeks of distraction. His calculus teacher, Mr. Grayson, had warmed up to him again, offering extra help after class to make sure he didn't fall behind. It was a small victory, but it felt like a step in the right direction. At Billy's auto shop, things returned to normal as well. Billy greeted him with a clap on the back when he returned to work, and the familiar smell of engine oil and the sound of clinking tools grounded Romeo in a way that nothing else could. Working with cars was his passion, and despite everything that had happened, that hadn't changed. One afternoon, as he worked on a beat-up old truck, Romeo felt a sense of calm settle over him. The engine whirred softly beneath his hands, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a small spark of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, he knew that much, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. His family, his true friends, and people like Mrs. Roberts, they were the ones who mattered. They were the ones who saw him for who he truly was. As he wiped the grease from his hands and closed the hood of the truck, Romeo looked out at the world beyond the garage, a new resolve taking shape inside him. He would rise above this. He would prove that he was more than the suspicion that had been cast on him, more than the rumors and the doubts. He would take the lessons he had learned from this experience and carry them with him as he moved forward. The future wasn't set in stone, but for the first time in a long time, Romeo felt like he had control over his own path again. And that, he realized, was all he needed.